Hello everyone, thank you so much for joining us at our free workshop today with the one and only Joe Kelly. This festival has been made possible by funding from the Arts Council England with support from Lenovo.
Hi everybody, thank you for coming. It's good to see you. It's evening where you are. I'm told that it's beer and or tea o'clock, so I appreciate you taking the time to hang out here. But if you have a beverage of your choice, then great. I've got my water and my coffee. But I'll try not to drink out of the big giant jug that I have because I'm told that's rude on Zoom. So I have a dainty glass. Welcome to How to Write for Comics. We're going to cover a bunch of stuff, and I've told as always, thank you to everybody at the Comic Arts Festival. It's just so lovely to be here. I'm sorry that we can't be together in person. The festival is really one of my favorite conventions that I go to, and have had the privilege to go a couple of times. And it's always so wonderful. The staff works so hard, and the fact that they've been able to bring a virtual version to you at all is really wonderful. So, hats off to everybody who's working so hard, and for all of you for coming to join and hang out. We're going to talk about specifics about writing in general, because I think writing in general is, we're here to talk about comics, but we have to talk about writing first. We'll do a little bit of comics specific, and then I have this elements of what I think makes for a good comic, which mostly focus on cast and conflict. So we're going to talk about that. There's definitely going to be time for questions, so write them down. Some people even sent a few questions in advance, so we'll go over that stuff. And hopefully my battery on my light will last. And if it doesn't, then I will put it on, and you'll get to see that age-old question of, do writers wear pants while they're on Zoom calls? But you guys are a classy audience, so I promise I wore pants today. They're the same pants I've worn since March, but I have been wearing pants for the calls. So first of all, writing, writing for comics. I want to show you a sort of a case study in what happens when you write for comics. Those of you who are interested, this is a photo. Let's see if this will let me go. So that was me in 1997 when I started on this journey, and the before and after is striking. This is what a career in comics will do to you. So I just want to warn you in advance. It's very important that you know. There's Steve Siegel. Steve Siegel looks exactly the same, just in case you're wondering. So Good Living in California looks like that. A Lifetime of Pain and Suffering and Irish Guilt looks like that. So now you know what you're getting into if you choose to pursue a career in comics. I started, like I said, in the 90s. I was very lucky. I was a graduate student at NYU. Marvel editors decided that they were looking for new talent, so they came to our program, which is the dramatic writing program. There, I was learning how to write screenplays and stage plays primarily. We didn't have a TV department yet, and I offered to help run the program. The true story, and if any of you have heard this before, I apologize, but the true story is that the secretary of the department, and I used to talk about comics. She was a lady who had learned how to read by reading Superman comics. She knew I like comics. So one day she told me there was a letter sitting on the director's desk with Spider-Man on it, and she said it's probably going to get thrown out because our program director at the time was just a playwright with a capital P. She had no interest in anything else. So I stole the letter, and as a graduate assistant in the department, ripped it open, found out they wanted to do this workshop, and then I gregariously volunteered to say, hey, I know something about comics. Did Marvel Comics contact you? And then I ran this workshop. And I always tell this story with the caveat of, you should not commit a mail felony to start your careers or to get further in your career, but opportunities show up in very strange ways. And that little opportunity, that conversation with a friend in the department about comic books, really led to my career. Those editors ran this workshop with me. we got a couple of students involved who were interested. They liked how I did dialogue specifically, and that led to my first job, doing a little bit of dialogue over a writer who was kind of running late on a deadline. And then that led to the next job, and the next job, and the next job. And then when that photo was taken, that was when I got the X-Men and with Steve, and that was about a year into my career. So again, just being lucky, it was the right place at the right time. Weird things were happening at Marvel, and but I hit all these boxes that were necessary at the time. Which, if you are interested in working for the big two companies or any big publisher, hitting the deadline is number one. Are you a warm body is, cell but it's, can you write well? Can you write fast? How you're a pleasure to work with? Like, those are the things that sort of get you going. And then once you're in the door, they'll throw a lot of work at you. And then you'll make decisions for yourself as to whether or not that's the life you want. Steve and I ultimately quit a year later because it was not what we wanted in that particular case. And we wound up working at DC. So I've written for both of the big two companies. I've written my own books. I've written film. I've written a lot of animation. And it all sort of comes together for me. I mean, just under that blanket umbrella of writing. And I think that is really where we have to start. Like, what does it take to be a writer? So the first thing that I would say is that you don't have to worry about fancy schools. You don't have to worry about the right programs. You don't have to worry about any of these tools that you hear people use, like, what's program do I use, any of that stuff. None of it matters. What matters most is committing yourself to time. Time is the one non-renewable resource we have in our lives, right? You can always figure out a way to save money if you needed to buy software. You could always figure out a way to, try to make an introduction to somebody if you wanted to meet somebody. I think all of us have access now with the internet to publishers and getting our work out there. That stuff is less important than the mental games that you have to go through. And how you spend your time is one of them. So we used to tell people, and when I say we, anytime, I promise it's not the royal we, it's Man of Action, which is myself, Steve, Joe Casey, and Duncan Rouleau. When people would come up to us at the booth, we used to talk a lot about pick a time every day and write every single day. And though I believe that's important, I've actually changed my stance on that a little bit after, many years of doing this, and also just sort of listening to other people talk about it, other writers. And what I think is important is making sure that you have sacred time. So what does that mean? Some people, just by nature of their work or their life, family obligations, etc., you don't have the ability to write every single day. And that puts kind of an unfair pressure on you. And we all are living in a gigantic pressure cooker right now. And the last thing you need is one more bit of pressure. Writing should be a fun, enriching experience for you. It's frustrating. There are times you're going to bang your head against the wall, but we're ultimately doing this because we love it. We want to do it. And we have to sort of dedicate a chunk of our lives to getting it done. So look at your day, look at your week, or look at your month. I heard part of the reason I changed my position on this was because somebody was telling a story. This is actually from Elizabeth Gilbert, wrote a book called Big Magic that's about her writing experience. And though she's as far afield from comics as possible, she became famous because of Eat, Pray, Love. She's a really great speaker and actually has some great thoughts about just the process. And that, I actually like that book quite a bit. It's up there with the Stephen King On Writing book, which I also highly recommend. For me, I love them both. But she was talking about somebody she knew who suffered from being bipolar and really only had chunks of time where she was fully lucid, maybe 2 or 3 times a month. But during those times, she wrote. And she knew that if I'm on the ball, if I'm on the beam, I know that I'm going to be okay. I'm going to carve out an hour to write. So think about the times in your week where you can do that and make that time precious. And that means precious, like no phone, no internet, no family, if you can get supported family folks at home to understand, like, I need an hour, I need 15 minutes, I need 2 hours, whatever it is, have them leave you alone so that you can just do the work. Your brain is always going to be noodling on problems. You know, it happens when you sleep, it happens, that's why we all have like aha moments in the shower or cutting the grass or whatever. But you need that time to sit in front of a pad of paper, typewriter, computer, whatever it is that you use. Nobody uses typewriters anymore, unless you're like a super hipster, but I always say a typewriter. You want to make that time to sit down and do that work, because that you can't get back, right? And that little bit of time, even if it was literally 20 minutes, will build up over, it'll accrue, and you will get pages. Comic book pages especially are not that hard to write, like to literally type, because they're short. They're not a full block of prose. So you could write a couple of pages in a couple of minutes if you know what it is that you want to write. They may not be good pages, and that's another thing they have to learn, but you could write really fast. So 20 minutes could add up very quickly. I mean, if you gave yourself a half an hour 4 times a week, easily you're going to get 2 pages written. You might get 3 or 4 pages written. If you really know what's going on, you could probably write 5 or 6 pages. And then in a week, that could be an issue. You know, that could be a 22-page issue. Okay, if it's not in a week, it's in 2 weeks, it's in 3 weeks. Those add up. So don't think, oh, 20 minutes is not enough. Make those 20 minutes, but make them precious and make them really sacred. So that's number one. Professionals also, this is all about professionalism. You have to act like a professional before you are a professional, period. So treating that time as sacred is really important. Treating your writing with respect, even if nobody's reading it, is really important, because you are your biggest cheerleader to begin with. So all this stuff that we want to do, whether your aspirations are to work for a big publisher or to self-publish, you are your biggest advocate right now. Nobody else is going to sit next to us and tell us what to do. I wish I had a coach sitting here, you know, telling me, get to it, do those push-ups and write those pages. I don't. I have to find that motivation within myself. And there are days that are hard. Part of the reason the days are hard is almost always fear, and it's almost insecurity. We, by our nature, are thinkers, and we think a lot. I don't know about you all, but I think way too much. I've often been told by my wife to stop thinking, also to shut up and go away and let her be. It's important, obviously, it's what we do, but those thoughts can sometimes get in the way of the work. And there's steps to writing, right? There's pre-writing, where you're just thinking about, what is my idea? What is the world? It's the fun daydreaming stuff. Then part of pre-writing is actually getting those notes down, making sure that they're in a tangible place, because your brain only has so much capacity. You can't hold everything up here. So you got to write it in a place you know is secure and is not going to disappear, so that you can come back to it, revisit it, and build on it. And then there's the first draft of anything. And people are always shocked when I tell them this, but it's really okay. You have to embrace this idea that your first draft will be terrible, and assume that everything that you love, every book you've ever read, every comic, every film, every song, the first draft was crap. It was the worst thing. And the artists put it down and they were like, I can't believe I just wrote this crappy, horrible thing. We all do it, and we've all done it, but we do it because once we have a thing, we can fix it. I cannot fix a blank page. A blank page is literally nothing. I can't fix nothing. But if you give me the worst writing on the planet, even if I had to go through and circle every 10th word and make like a tone poem out of it, I could do it. You know, you can always fix writing. You can't fix the blank page. So this is part of treating yourself like a professional. If you had a regular job and you were set up to do an issue, you would have a schedule. You would write a first draft. You'd let it sit for a little bit of time. You'd come back to it. You'd go, okay, well, that first page was rubbish. Let me fix that. You'd rewrite the scene. You'd work your way through. You'd work with an editor. You'd get the stuff back. You keep refining until the time comes to let it go. And then that's probably the hardest part, is the letting it go part. If you've gotten over the hump of being worried about, oh, I suck, and having time and making sure you write, and you've actually written a thing, you've got to share it with the world. Because, and I'm guilty of this, I've got plenty of half-written scripts that are in a folder somewhere in this computer that will never see the light of day. Some of them are 20 years old, half of a movie, you know, half of a comic, all this stuff. We have to finish things. That's professional thing number 3, I guess. Make sure you finish, and then we have to give them out to the world. Now, what that might mean, if you're somebody who writes and draws, that means, okay, now shifting your brain into drawing mode. I've got a script, here I go, and I start doing it. If you're working with an artist, it's going, okay, I'm now feel enough courage, I can give it to an artist. If you have people that you really trust that are in your writer circle, you can give it to them, but make sure that you're giving it to people who are giving you real responses, that will actually get back to you, because it's very hard to ask somebody to read your 300-page graphic novel and give you feedback. As somebody who just recently finished a 350-page graphic novel, can tell you, it's there's not a lot of people I would send that to. You send it out into the world, and then you see what comes next. And then the hardest part is then you do it again. You do it again, no matter what. If you want to write, you have to keep writing. You can't wait to see if that first book becomes a hit. You can't wait to see if that first book is going to make you money, any of that stuff. You just keep going, because we all get better the more we do the craft, the more we work on the thing. I've been doing a thing on Instagram where I've been putting up a photo a day. Photography is just a side hobby for me. I love it. I've always been interested in it, primarily because it's instantaneous. You know, somebody who works on projects that take 2 years to come out, it's nice to take a photograph and then edit it a little bit on the computer, go, wow, look at that, I made an art, and then put it out there. That's fun. But I wanted to see if I could do it every single day. And I've consistently done it now every day. There's no payoff. There's no, some people see it. It's nice to get likes. I get some comments. I've actually met some cool people from around the world. Somebody actually in England who we became friendly with, back and forth just through love of photography. And that was really cool. But I do it every day. And when I look at the photographs I'm putting out now versus what I started doing in January, they are better. I haven't taken any massive classes. I haven't done anything. I'm just learning my camera better. I'm playing with lenses in a different way. The same thing happens with your writing. The more we do it, the better we get. Especially if we have some kind of a feedback loop with people we trust, or an artist or editor who will kind of poke back and go, is this really what you meant? Is this really what you wanted to say? This is what I got. And then you're making sure that the thing in your head has actually been conveyed to the people that you expect to read your work. That feedback loop is a little hard to find, but it's really helpful when you can get it. So that's a general, very fast overview of how I think you have to approach writing just as a professional. Writing for comics specifically, there were a couple of little questions that had come through these are the rapid fire questions I'll hit. Structurally, in terms of the literal script for a comic, if you're just writing and you're not drawing for yourself, there is not an accepted format. The industry, I think, is migrating towards certain styles, but there's not actually any sort of standardized format, because we're not subject to the same stuff that TV and film have, where it's a page a minute, approximately. Anybody who's ever seen an Alan Moore script knows that he could write 75 pages for a 22-page comic, right? Like, we have the ability to describe every cup that's on a table and what's in it and what is a person thinking and all that sort of stuff. I'm a little guilty of that. I don't quite hit Alan levels, but my scripts are pretty long. And that's okay, as long as your artist, you're conveying stuff that your artist needs, right? You're being clear on the page. My scripts tend to look like movie scripts. So partly because that's how I was trained, but I feel like it's the most comprehensive way to deliver the information. So I will put like a slug line for what the scene is. Then I describe things to the degree that I need them described, and then I put in the dialogue. I don't literally number the panels. Many people do. There's not a right or wrong way. The reason I don't is because I like to let the artist feel that if they want to combine things or move things around, it's okay. If there's something that really requires a pacing gag, so for example, if I wanted to show some bit of action and I thought it would be interesting by, it's funny, I'm looking at the little row of faces at the top of the Zoom screen. If I wanted to have that sort of staccato feel of somebody's running and I just want to see feet, I would explain that, and I would say, okay, I need a thin strip of just feet, staccato, a couple of panels, give us the impression of running. Then I would call it out. Or if there's an image I think is really important, I'll call that out as a splash page or as a big image on the page. But generally, I don't number the panels. People do. It works for communication, makes it really easy to say on page 2, panel 3, you asked for this. What does that mean? So it's really more about clarity. That is a full script method. So when I'm putting down dialogue and across the page scene direction, I'm doing a full script. The other version that people tend to gravitate towards is plot-driven writing. It's also sort of known as the Marvel style. I don't really think that the guys at Marvel invented this style. As a quick side note, one of my first jobs was working on Daredevil, and I got to work with Gene Colan, who, if you know Gene's work, is a comics legend. I was a young writer. I was like, okay, cool. I get to work with Gene Colan. This is great, on a character that he's known for. And one day he called me up and he said, hey, I was wondering if we could do it the way that Stan and I used to do it. And I'm very excited. I'm like, oh my God, I'm going to learn I'm at the feet of giants. How did Stan do it? And he goes, he would call me on the phone and he would say, so this episode, Matt's going to fight a bank robber. And then he's going to get into a fight with Mr. Hyde. And so go draw that. And I was like, okay. I said, Gene, I don't think they'll pay me to do that. I don't think I'm allowed to do that. So we did agree that I would hand him his script. But the Marvel style, as it's affectionately known, is just giving the plot, right? So what some people like about that is that they're giving their artist a lot of freedom. They're also honestly shoving off on the artist. Oh, you figure out how this is going to work. I'm just kind of like giving you generally what's going to happen. You make it fit in 22 pages or 20 pages as the current state is. I'm not a fan of that for myself. It does work for certain people. And one of the fun parts about it is that comics always give you a second bite at the apple, right? You get your art back from your artist, and then you have the opportunity to dialogue. With the plot style, you get lots of surprises, and sometimes those surprises can really spark kind of a great tension between you and your artist in a way that puts energy in the page that might not have been there before if you were very prescriptive. But it could also, you could get something you did not expect and it really throws you off base. Or if you weren't clear and saying the Hulk fights the Thing for 5 pages was not enough information, now you have to figure out, how do I make this work and how do I do the dialogue and that. So it's not my favorite way to do it. Even in the beginning, when I look back on my earlier scripts, I sort of was doing a looser plot style, but I still had the dialogue in there because I felt the acting was very important for the characters. So that's a nuts and bolts thing. There's a million scripts online. You can look and see how all your favorite folks do it. But there's really no wrong way. As long as you're consistent, and if you had to show it to an editor or an artist, your English is clear, you're conveying your ideas in a way that nobody's going to be confused, that's fine. That's going to be professional. So don't worry about what program you use, any of that stuff. That's all out the window. As far as other technical stuff, there's really not a lot. I mean, those of you who are writing and drawing for yourselves, I would recommend that you write as much as possible before you draw. And that's mostly just from the experience of working with friends of mine that do both, because I know friends who have started drawing too early and then found themselves at a dead end and don't know what to do. And then they wind up chucking pages. So if they've at least figured out the plot, then they're in a little bit safer scenario. So I would say do that. The actual physical medium itself comes with a few cool things that other ones don't. So like I said before, with animation or with writing for TV or film, we worry about this sort of page a minute rule of thumb. Some of the rules of thumb for comics are, obviously it's a visual medium. When people are in the store, we all do it. We flip through and we're attracted to the art first, and then the story is what keeps us. We have to be aware of that. And it's a little humbling if you're a writer. You have to remember, like, yeah, people are actually looking at the pretty pictures. That's kind of important. But it's good. We want the art to shine. We want to write to the strengths of our artist. So if you're doing superhero scenarios or some sort of big flashy thing, you want to make sure you give big visual punch to those moments. And it's sort of common sense. When you see it, you're like, of course, that moment was really important. That's why it's so big. But it's not always clear when those moments should be. So for example, an explosion. I think especially for new writers, there's instinct of like, oh, an explosion in a movie, that would be a big moment, and I should make that a splash page or a double page spread. That is a waste of real estate. Who cares? Like, an explosion, even drawn by the greatest artist on the planet, like, is this cloud, like, that's it, and some lines that go this way. I think there's a filter on Zoom that would be like the explosion filter. I could probably do it. That is not how you want to use your real estate. Very interesting, novel visual moments, like an establishing shot of a city nobody's ever seen before, characters nobody's seen before, emotional moments that really matter, that we don't want to just make one tiny panel, although sometimes that does work for us, that tiny panel, because it's a quiet, intimate moment. Saving those big moments for something that really matters. That's what you've got to do. So think about that as you're sort of laying out your plot. Also, the page turn is really critical. I don't know if we sort of think about it that much. I was taught very early on to always end the page turn on a question. And this may sound like it's sort of like overthinking it, but I actually think it's part of the psychology of a good comic. When you talk about writing for TV or film or whatever, you assume that the audience is going to watch the whole thing. But the truth is, if the story doesn't kick off or something interesting doesn't happen in the first 5 to 15 minutes, people get bored and they leave, especially now in the world of streaming. And I'll tell you, having done some stuff with Netflix, they literally know to the minute when you're bored. They can actually tell, yeah, if we don't have you by 90 seconds in, the show is not going to work. So they're very conscious of that stuff. That's different medium. But comics, it is the same thing. We turn the page. It's the only time where we have like a moment where we don't know what's happening. So ending on a question, whether it's an emotional question, an action question, like I've just been thrown out the window, what's coming next? Anything that's going to evoke a mystery, so that when you turn the page, there's a little moment of excitement and then a payoff for that page turn. That's like a deep level psychology thing for comics that other medium don't have. I don't think novels are plotted out that way. I don't think they think that much about the text. Maybe they do. I've never done that, but we have to think that way. I'm sure anybody who's, if you've paid any attention to sort of phones and how we're manipulated by social media companies and all that stuff, it's all about those little dopamine hit, right? It's that little mental reward that we get from, what happens when I turn on my phone, and did somebody give me a like, or is there a new photo of a kitten, or whatever it is that we're interested in. That's what we're giving to people when we turn the page. And sometimes you just can't do it. Sometimes you have a scene and just doesn't fall there. But if you can find a way to do it, it's a really valuable tool in the toolbox. It's one of the few ones, sort of along with bigger images versus smaller images, that I would say are actually really important to keep in mind when you're writing for comics. Then in general, there's sort of bigger questions about, how do you tell a graphic novel story that's self-contained, and what about an ongoing series and things like that. Those I can try to answer specifics about at the end, but the thing for me, and this is where I'll get into my highly technically innovative PowerPoint project moment here for you, is just what makes a comic work. And for me, the focus that I always give, obviously we want to have a cool concept, right? And I think I'll take a pause here before I get into this part. One of the things that people are always asking, there's actually a question that somebody sent me in advance, which is, how do you know if an idea is worth pursuing? Is it a good idea, a great idea, or is it just something stupid you came up with? I was thinking today about like Groundhog's Day, because many of us are living it at the moment. And I've now seen Groundhog's Day done 3 different ways this year. There's a thing on Netflix called Palm Springs, where they did Groundhog's Day. There's the Happy Death Day horror version of it, which is Scott Lobdell's creation. So shout out to Comics Guy. And then I was thinking about adapted from the manga. What is it? The All You Need Is Kill. Now I can't remember. Live, Die, Repeat is the slogan. I can't remember the Tom Cruise thing. So all of those took that idea of I'm replaying my day over and over and exploited them in a different way. And then Groundhog's Day, of course. So the idea doesn't matter. No, now my stupid phone's going to ring. Sorry. The idea does not matter in and of itself. It's your personal execution of that idea. That is the thing that makes it special. This has definitely become the probably the most important piece of advice that we give to people at the booth, is you have to tell the story that only you can tell. I'm sure a lot of us on this call like fantasy. A lot of us like superheroes. A lot of us like slice of life stories. If I said to you, I want to tell a fantasy story about a band of adventurers and they have to go to a mountain and, finish a quest. Like, okay, that's Lord of the Rings, but it's not. It could also be just somebody's really bad, sort of fantasy idea. What do you care about? What is the thing that you can bring? And that'll mostly be articulated in a theme. So the themes that are most important to you are what's going to come through in your work. Lord of the Rings, for example, just to go to that one, is, the smallest person can make the biggest difference. Like, that is one of the big themes of Lord of the Rings. And there's obviously a lot of deeper stuff, and there's a lot of religious connotations, and we won't get into all that stuff. But the big driver, the smallest person can make the biggest difference. That's huge. And it plays out throughout the entire thing, right? That separates it from, I don't know, pick at some other fantasy story where it's more about, it's about the friends we met along the way, to use that old trope. I mean, there's something different, but there's something special. Strength comes from within. Maybe you've had some sort of adversity in your life and you were able to overcome it. And you don't want to just do a replay of that. You really want to channel that through a fantasy lens. Your version of that story will make it good. That's the thing that we care about. Same with superheroes. I mean, there's 500 superheroes a year, but the ones we care about and the ones that kind of rise to the top, they have something to say. There's something unique. They're written from your point of view, your history, your perspective. So that's what you should focus on. And then how do I take that experience and put it into a theme? The next graphic novel, the giant one that I have that's coming out, Ken Nomura, who drew I Kill Giants, is drawing it. And a lot of it comes from autobiographical stuff. It's mostly hidden. If you knew my life, it would be less cleverly hidden, but most people would not know that it has stuff to do with my life. My father was a police officer. So it's a slice of life story on the one hand, pushed to the extreme because it's got some comedy and some drama in it that did not happen to me or my dad, but it's me working through a lot of stuff about my relationship with my father as a police officer. And coincidentally, not because of the times that we live in, how race sort of came in and out of that, and out of his life, specifically in his time as a policeman. That story only I could write. I'm the one who sat at the dinner table, and when my dad would say, pass the cranberry sauce at Thanksgiving, as he looked at it, would go, "Hey, did I ever tell you about that guy we found in the basement that did X, Y, and Z?" Like, that happened to me a lot as a kid. I did have more than one therapist ask me if that might have had an influence on how I am. We'll see. But I know other adult children of police officers who had that experience. But most normal people don't sit around the dinner table and talk about murder scenes. And like, for real murder scenes, not like I saw it on Netflix. But we did. And that was how my father dealt with these things. So that's what I was able to sort of bring to that story. And on the other side of the spectrum, quite a while back there, I wrote a Superman story where Superman and Batman team up because Lois has gone missing, and Superman bona fide believes that she's dead, and they're trying to find her. Half of the dialogue that Batman says in that book came directly from my dad, talking about his experiences as a detective. He retired as a detective sergeant, and the things that he went through, what it was like to be on a case. And he was a local county cop. He wasn't like a Manhattan, like, super cool cop. I mean, he was just a regular cop. But regular cops deal with a lot of stuff, and they have to become dispassionate about how they look at the victims and all this sort of stuff. There's a lot of psychology involved. That's all in that episode, that issue of Superman. So my personal stuff gets dumped into these books all the time. Focus on the story that only you can tell, and you will be on the right track. The rest of the stuff you can figure out. So now that brings me to the stories themselves, and what are we going to populate them by? So comics, like I said, beautiful art is pulling us in, beautiful story is keeping us, but that beautiful story is really going to be articulated through the characters. Okay, so what I'd like to do is focus on character and creating character, and sort of how those themes and those layers that we're going to build into our characters will keep the books exciting and fresh for everybody. So I know I'm already getting close to the time. So if anybody has to dip, I will totally understand. But I will probably talk over the time because I do like to ramble, and it's Saturday. So for me, it's okay. So I'm going to open this thing up, and I know one of my friends is here and has seen this before. So I'm sorry, Peter, that you're going to have to see this again. But here we go. So let me make sure I get this correct. Boom. Let's start the slideshow. All right. Is there a slide thing up? Are we seeing a thing that says character, cast, and conflict? All right, good. I see some thumbs up. Thank you. Okay. So to make our comics stories in general, this is what I was taught to make them cool. And to make them strong. So this is a combination of some stuff that I learned during my time at NYU, and some stuff that I learned from Marvel in the early days. And this is stuff that I continue to do. I always do. I love it. We have to develop characters that are layered and really interesting, and that are pulling in our audience. We want to make sure that they see parts of themselves in these characters, but also we want to make sure that they're getting the parts of you that you need to present. And we have a couple of ways that we can do this on a surface level. We have the physical attributes, and this is like the fun stuff, right? Like, this is where we sit there and we go, oh yeah, they're from Chicago, but it's future Chicago, where everybody's made of water, and whatever nonsense comes out. So we have a physical attribute, and then how do they speak? This is probably one of my favorite areas. I love doing character voices. If you know that I worked on Deadpool for many, many years, you know that I love comedy, I love jokes, I love character voice, and I like making distinguishing vocal characteristics and dialogue characteristics. When I wrote X-Men, I wrote a character called Maggot. Maggot did not have a strong personality when I inherited him. He was from South Africa, so I found a website that had all this South African slang, and I basically made his dialogue incomprehensible because they have some really weird slang. And it was great. I loved it, and it made him stand out. But I always knew what he was saying. I mean, he always had other pain and things going on. Backstory. I do think backstory is important to know for your characters. I'm not necessarily an advocate of spending a year and a half trying to figure out what they had for breakfast when they were 5 and how that brings you up to the story that you're telling. But if that is your method, cool, have at it. Just make sure that when you're working on these components of character, that it's not procrastination, because sometimes we can get caught up in details and it keeps us from doing the hard work, which is figuring out the story. It's pretty easy to sit there and go like, okay, and then in 3rd grade, they did this, and then something happened to them in 5th grade. That might be helpful for your story, but just try to focus on the key elements. And the same with psychology. Psychology, you really do have to know. And that's more of what we're going to get into next. That's probably the most powerful out of all of this stuff, because you can take characters that look exactly the same. We could go down the list of your favorite superheroes, your favorite sci-fi characters, anybody that are essentially like cool dude in armor, cool lady with a sword, any of that stuff. But it's the psychology of why are they doing the things that they're doing that's going to make them special. So all this stuff will be fun. All this stuff will be in your head. But the only way that we're actually revealing character is through action. What a character says does not matter, even though I love dialogue. It's what they do is what matters, how they behave. And this, I'm sure we have all experienced in our real lives at some point. Somebody will tell you that they are going to meet you for lunch, and they never do. Somebody will always promise you, oh yeah, I'm going to be there to help you. And then every time that you call, they're not. That is what reveals who they are, right? And vice versa. Somebody you thought, every time you walk by them, they're like, oh yeah, whatever, they blow you off. You get locked out of your house, they're the first person to, hey, you need help, you want me to call somebody, that is a surprise. That's their character. That's how you start to learn about the world and about people. So in this particular case, that is what we're going for. We want to reveal through action. So how do we decide how a character will act in a given situation? This is going to come from the motivations and what their sort of internal flaws are. So the motivational model that I learned is a sort of layered version for characters. So let's see, I jumped ahead of my own panels here. So we're forcing our characters into conflict. Conflict is how we're going to reveal action. And the way that we're going to get to that conflict is we have to know their psychology, which is what I said before. So sorry about that. We're giving them wants and motivations to guide us along the way. That stuff should be really important for you and should be crystal clear. The motivations of your characters are going to mostly be reflections of whatever your bigger theme is. So smallest person can do the greatest amount of good. You're going to have a small person who doesn't think they can do any good. And there's reasons for that. Or you're going to have a small person who thinks that they are great and they can handle everything. And that's going to play out in a certain way. Then you have a big person who thinks the small person is insignificant. And you have a big person who thinks the small person is the most important person. These things are going to come along when we get into building the whole cast. But that you see how that psychology that informs each of those characters comes from the theme. So if you have a strong theme, a strong point of view, it actually makes it easier to start to flesh out that cast. And having those differing points of view around that theme will create this conflict and this tension. So when we're setting up these characters, we don't want them to all be on the nose, right? And very obvious types of characters. Sometimes that's fun. Like it's fun to have the Punisher for a little while where he's like, I want to kill the bad guy. That's cool. But layered characters are of more interest to me. And I think will ultimately give you a story that is richer and will last longer. So this is the model that I was sort of taught in terms of how we layer the character motivations. So the first layer that people see, that your audience is introduced to and the world is introduced to, is your main character will say something that they want, but it's not true. Okay, so in this silly example that I have here, we have a character that's just, I want a pizza. And this is just their very surface level, like they literally are saying these things out loud. I want to save the world. I want to rob a bank. I want to kill my neighbor's dog. Whatever the thing is, they're saying it out loud, but it's not true. It's not actually what they want. The second layer of motivation is what the character secretly wants. Okay, so they're not sharing this with the audience. And this is something that we're going to discover while we go on a journey with them. Okay, so in the case of our pizza person, so I want to go to that pizza place so I can talk to the girl behind the counter. They're not going to fess up to this. This is going to maybe get pulled out of them, you know, as we're moving through the book or as we're moving through the story. Like finally, why do you want the pizza so badly? It's like, oh, you know, so-and-so's there. This is a moment of vulnerability for them when they get to this sort of secret part. And it's pretty important. And this will cross apply to why do you really want to save the world? Why do you want to kill your neighbor's dog? Like all this stuff. You'll see that it can work. But that is not the final level. And this is really, when you look at story arcs in general, I'm going to assume that you guys have heard about rising action, and I'll just go very quickly through, you know, Act 1 is the setup. You hit a point of no return. Act 2 is rising action with complications, where your character is confronted with a lot of problems. This is sort of what happens in Act 2, where they start to have to question why they went on this journey to begin with. That builds up to a crisis point. And at the crisis, you have the Act 3, which is either the story is resolved or the story is not resolved. But in that Act 3, we get into the final layer of the character's motivation. So during the course of the story, the character discovers the deepest truth about themselves that they did not know existed. This is the hardest turn to make, but it's the one that gives the most punch to the story. So in this particular case, meeting the girl at the pizza place forced me to confront this uncomfortable incident from my past that I have to deal with before my secret gets out. So, good, the phone stopped. So that might be, you know, she might have reminded this character of their mother, or she might have reminded this character of, you know, somebody they lost, you know, back in the day. Like, who knows what it is. With I Kill Giants, if you happen to know that book, it's the graphic novel I did with Ken. I want to kill giants. That's what Barbara says right up top. I want to kill giants. Her secret desire is that she thinks she can save her mom, right? That's her secret desire that eventually comes out. But the real truth, the absolute truth of what it is that she needs to confront her fear of death. That's what she needs to confront. And she needs to not feel afraid of an inevitability that's coming. That's her arc. And that's how it plays out, you know, in a real example for I Kill Giants. So those are layers of character motivation. I know I'm going through this stuff quick, but hopefully it makes sense. Now, those motivations are going to put characters into conflict with other characters. If we don't have conflict, we do not have a story. If everybody gets along, it is boring. Some people take this to the extreme, and when you have, I don't know, a Justice League where everybody fights just because, then it's not necessarily helpful for you. I would avoid conflict just for arbitrary reasons, but we want to generate real conflict between our characters. And the way you can do that, especially if you have I'm going to start with one character. If you have a main protagonist, the best way you can generate conflict is with the people around them. It's their supporting cast. And this is where there's a tool that I use called the character wheel. Now, I was taught this character wheel when I first started working at Marvel Comics. Marvel Comics used to have this assistant editor class. They still do it now, actually, where the editors come in and they sit down with the assistants and they go through the basics of storytelling. So the guys who taught it to me learned this from Mark Grunwald. Mark was an editor at Marvel for a very long time. He was also a writer, had a a very fun run on a lot of books. I think most notably Captain America. I think he's responsible for Capwolf for sure, and might have been involved in Throg too. He had a thing for turning superheroes into animals. But Mark was a very funny man. He was a smart guy. Unfortunately, he passed away way too young, quite a few years ago. But this is the lesson that he taught the assistant editors, and they passed along to me. So I always feel it's important to give the credit. So we're going to use a little known character called Spider-Man to do this. The point of the wheel is that it's a diagnostic tool. Okay, so this is not like a live or die, like if you don't do this, your comic will not work. I don't think any of these things are, to be perfectly honest. Even 3-act structure, though, there's a reason I think you can't get away from that. We'll talk about in a minute. Dan Harmon's story circle works perfectly fine. It's a guideline, right? All this stuff are guidelines. So this tool will just help you look visually. I'm a visual guy. It'll help you look at a cast visually and go, yeah, there's conflict built into this, or no, this is a pretty soft cast. There's things I can do to make it stronger. The wheel will also identify why these characters exist. They have a plot purpose and they have an emotional purpose. And it's critical that you have both. If you don't, then they're really just set dressing. And that's okay. Sometimes you need a character to get punched in the face and never come back again. Sometimes you need a character that just, no matter what, when you look at them, they make you cry. But it's better if they do both, especially if they're part of the ongoing cast. Now, I will also add the caveat that this wheel was sort of crafted for ongoing books. So you'll see sort of parallels, and when you take this back and think about other projects, you can apply this to anything. But stories that are ongoing is probably the place where you get the most value out of this, because you have to come up with so many stories. You need ways to make sure your scenes have more energy in them. And if you use this wheel properly, you always have conflict around the main character, which is great. Also, this will give this cast theme reflections. So like I said before, when I was sort of riffing on the Lord of the Rings idea, if you look at all the characters around Frodo, and if the theme is the smallest person can make the biggest difference, each character around him reflects that theme in a different way. Some people believe in that, some people don't believe in that. Their own internal issues inform how they look at Frodo, all that stuff. So you want that theme to be played out in all these characters. So our little known character, Spider-Man, is how we're gonna try this out. And we're going OG Spider-Man. This is from, when Stan and Steve Ditko laid out this cast from the beginning. So if some of you are very young and have only seen the movies, you may not know all these characters, but I'm hoping that people will know this. So one of the greatest lines of comicdom: with great power comes great responsibility. This is the thing that pulls at Spider-Man at all times, right? This is his greatest character conflict, is that he lives in this balance between great power and great responsibility. It does not just mean spider powers versus caring for Aunt May. We can extrapolate with great power and great responsibility that power is like fun, right? Like he's a young guy, he lives close to Manhattan. Manhattan is really exciting. At the time where he lived in Queens, it was just a quiet suburb. Like he doesn't want that, he wants the exciting life. Of course, there's powers, there's excitement, there's chaos. That's the great power part. Then the great responsibility part is humility. It's obviously Aunt May. It's just the real life world. It's the thing that made Marvel Comics so special, was our superheroes were dealing with real life, and it was probably never articulated better than with Peter. So that is those two poles are always pulling at Peter. So once we establish that, then we start putting the cast around it. And this is the plot function, emotional function. So there's our friend J. Jonah Jameson. Oddly, he hasn't aged much either. His plot function in the story is that he's the boss, he's a source of income, and he's a potential source of stories. Because when he's like, Parker, I need you to get me pictures down by the docks, then all of a sudden he can propel Peter into a story. Emotionally, he serves two things. He's constantly forcing Peter to question himself as Spider-Man because he's such an anti-Spider-Man guy. At first, he just wants to sell newspapers, but then he likes making, he believes that he's a menace and all that sort of stuff. And it forces Peter to define himself. Like, who am I really? If the city sees me as this way, or if Jameson sees me as this way, do I believe that, or do I believe something stronger? So that's the difference between the plot function and the emotional function. If every character can have that, you're in great shape. So we start with the love interest, because this is a book made theoretically for young men when it was first created. That's what it was for. And we're going to start with our young guy and making sure that he's got love interest. On the great power side, we've got Mary Jane Watson. Mary Jane is introduced in the book as a mystery character, and she is a crazy redheaded hippie. That is how she's introduced. If you don't believe me, look at those early books. We literally did a thing in Deadpool where we went back in time to one of her first appearances, and she walks into a house and she says, "I'm here to help you move." And then she just starts dancing. That's what she did. That's Mary Jane. On the other side, we had great responsibility character, Gwen Stacy. Gwen was the girl who Peter theoretically would marry, right? Father's a policeman and a pillar of the community. She really likes Peter as a science guy. She appreciates him in high school, like as a nerd, like all of his sort of normal life stuff. She's his buddy, like she's his friend. So they are pulling at different sides of him. Mary Jane is always going off on the back of a motorcycle to do something cool and be like, "See you later, Tiger." And Gwen is like, "All right, we're going to study for the science fair, and one day you'll have a great job and be responsible." They naturally are going to be pulling at Peter in different ways. So there's very obviously, when we want to force Peter into a choice and reveal his character, if we put the two of them in a scene, they are really forcing him to make a decision. Then we've got his sort of quote unquote parents. J. Jonah Jameson, who we've already talked about, he's the worst father figure on the planet, who on occasion is nice. Maybe he's not the worst father figure. We'll get to the worst one. But he sort of acts as a de facto dad for Peter. And Aunt May, poor old Aunt May, before she was Marissa Tomei, was literally, if you looked at her sideways, she broke her hip. She always needed medicine. Maybe she was a secret drug addict. I really don't know. But no matter what happened, every episode was Aunt May. Oh my God, she ate a piece of a bagel and she's choking and dying. Like, it was just, Aunt May was always falling apart. She's also the literal embodiment of his greatest failure, right? Not stopping the burglar who shot Uncle Ben led to the widowed Aunt May. So she serves such a huge emotional component for Peter's character, like a purpose. She's always pulling him in that direction of guilt and responsibility. And then there's literal things that she does as his sort of mom. Then we've got some friends that we put in, and again in quotes, because Flash Thompson, especially in the beginning, is just a jerk, right? He's a bully. But he's also like big man on campus. He's everything that Peter wants to be and could be if he would just unleash like the spider powers. He could be head of the football team. He could do anything he wants. So Flash is an actual draw in that direction. And ironically, Flash is a huge fan of Spider-Man. So that's a little twist of the knife for Peter, because they'll shove Peter in a locker and then say about how much he loves Spider-Man. But Flash is on that side. Sort of evolves over time, and he kind of becomes like sort of a dopey big brother. And then later on, he has his own issues. But that's how he starts out. And then on the other side is poor Harry, with the most unfortunate hair in comics. Harry Osborn, who is sort of a well-intentioned dope who happens to be wealthy. He knows that people hang out with him because his dad has money, but he is genuinely a nice kid and he likes Peter. They have a relationship where he's always helping, Peter's always helping him with his schoolwork and being hired to tutor him. He's a real friend. He's a real pal. So that's how they are, again, polar opposites. So now we have this cast laid out, and it's pretty balanced, right? This is a cast that we want to have. We want to see something like this if we're telling a series of ongoing stories where when we want to get some emotional grist for the mill out of Peter, we can start plucking from either side of this and putting characters against one another to reveal who Peter really is. The most obvious ones are all the polar ones, right? So if you have a direct conflict between J. Jonah Jameson is like, Parker, get to work, and Aunt May is like, I tripped on a paperclip and my both hips flew off and I need you to come home, Peter. Then you know he's stuck. Do I earn money or do I help Aunt May? Whatever he chooses to do reveals his character. Those are the really obvious ones, but you can get more subtle ones kind of when they're not the direct polar opposite. So for example, Mary Jane and Aunt May in a scene together where Mary Jane is like, hey, Tiger, I just stole a car because that's, I'm crazy like that. Let's go for a ride. And Aunt May is like, oh, Peter, I made you your favorite wheat cakes. And he has to decide what to do. That's a little bit more of a subtle distinction. It's not the direct, like, these are my two love interests or these are my two parents, but how he responds to that situation reveals his character. So if he's like, okay, Aunt May, I'm going to have the wheat cakes, we know that he is going to behave in a certain way. If he told Mary Jane, oh, I'd love to go with you in a joyride in a stolen car, but then he doesn't, that's going to have an impact on their relationship. And it also reveals, again, what he said didn't matter. It's what he does that matters. This will serve you in scenes where you're like, I'm getting the plot across, but it just doesn't feel like something's happening. Anytime you pluck characters from opposite sides of the wheel and put them in the scene, or have them, they don't even have to literally be there, but they're sort of pulling in one way. In the scene before, Gwen said, I'll see you tonight at the science fair. And then in the next scene, Jonah is like, I need you to go to the docks to get me a picture of Spider-Man snorting cocaine. That will have an impact on how the story plays out. So they don't have to literally be in the same scene, but you just want to make sure that those moments are pulling at Peter and your main character in that way. This lasts for a long time. And then after a while, you start to get a little bit bored. So you need to mix it up. And that's when you start introducing another type of character. You can have characters that are a dark reflection of your main character, and they do fall right in the middle. In our case, it's the Goblin, who is also, of course, Norman Osborn. Norman Goblin is a really interesting character because he is a sort of polar opposite of Peter. Like, he has great power and great responsibility. He's a little, because he's insane ultimately because of the Goblin stuff, softens him a little bit in terms of his decision making, but he is mostly complicit in who he is. But he can relate to Peter in a lot of ways. He actually likes Peter. Norman likes Peter more than he likes Harry, which is sort of interesting. He is always encouraging him to be a better scientist, wants to give him a job, all that stuff. And then, of course, the Goblin becomes his ultimate enemy, right? So those characters are really interesting. I think you have to use them sparingly, though, because the gradations, this is very obvious. We have a very, clear good guy, bad guy scenario. When you get into a little bit more subtle versions, one is probably enough. Two, you start getting into like, okay, they're the same, You don't want to dilute the main character by giving too many of this type. But the Goblin shakes things up. And when he's acting more like Norman, he's sort of pulling Pete to one side. When he's acting more like the Goblin, he's pulling him to another side. Then tragedy strikes. Now, with any good soap opera, which is really what the early Spider-Man is, soap opera with superpowers, characters disappear from their wheel. I don't recommend killing characters arbitrarily. It's boring, but eventually you want to shake the wheel up, and one way to do that is getting rid of a character. So poor Gwen Stacy, spoiler, if you have not heard this story for the 60 years since it was written, she gets thrown from the top of the Brooklyn Bridge by the Goblin, and she dies. I will let the internet decide whether or not Spider-Man accidentally snapped her neck in trying to save her. That is not my place to judge. I don't think he did. She was going to die anyway. So now she's gone. We take her off the board. What happens to the wheel? The wheel is now out of balance. Some of the forces that pull Peter towards the responsibility side are gone. That can impact on your main character in a lot of interesting ways. It might make them gravitate more towards the people that are on the other side of the wheel, the great power side. He might start acting out. He may want to follow more of his baser instincts because he's angry. He's lost like an anchoring presence in his life. It might also make the characters that are on the unbalanced side more important. I lost Gwen. I'm not going to lose Aunt May. So now I'm obsessed with Aunt May. You know, like I'm going to make sure that she never leaves bed, and I'm going to put her in bubble wrap, and she can't break a hip on anything today. You start to mess with the wheel. You start to get really interesting things once you've established a baseline for your characters. So then, dun dun dun, we get rid of the goblin. Killing the goblin has repercussions. And yeah, he killed himself by accident because of his own hubris. Spider-Man did not kill him, but he is framed for the murder of Norman Osborn. As a result of that, because of the connections of the character, the wheel gets totally out of whack, because now Harry, who blames Spider-Man for the death of his father, it can't really be looked at as a friend anymore, even though he's a friend to Peter, because all he talks about is wanting revenge on Spider-Man. And Peter has nothing but guilt about, like, but you don't know your father was a supervillain and I can't tell you, and he was a terrible human being, and you know, so he winds up on the great parasite. So now Spidey's wheel is whacked. Like, life is very out of balance for him. You can do this on purpose. Okay, so if this were Deadpool for a second, and I have Deadpool in the middle, Deadpool's primary character conflict is I want to do good things, people want me to do horrible things, right? Like that's a primary character conflict for Deadpool. His wheel looked like this. He had like two people on my run that believed in him. It was like Blind Al, who conspicuously looks like Aunt May, you may have noticed, with glasses on. And you know, Weasel doesn't really believe in him that much. Siren believed in him. So there's a couple of, so he had two people that believed in him and thought he could be a good guy. Everybody else, the entire cast, is on the other side going, yeah, you're a horrible dirtbag. Let's go kill some stuff for money. We kept that way on purpose because I always wanted tension on Deadpool. I wanted to make it as hard as possible for him. So don't think of this wheel as it needs to be balanced. This is just a way for you to look at this stuff and go, oh yeah, is this world completely screwing over my main character in the way I want to? Yes, great, here we go. There's a lot of examples that come to mind, especially when you're in like noir, or if you're doing any kind of sort of heavy science fiction, dark fantasy, where there's just very few sort of lighter characters or characters that draw your main character towards positive things. Everyone else is pulling them towards the darkness, right? That is perfectly fine. Just make sure it's your intention, because if you just sort of accidentally trip into that, then there's like a disharmony between your intent and what actually gets executed on the page. So then over time, Mary Jane settles down. She lays down the pipe and she's done, and she becomes the girl next door. And this happened over many, many years. She just stopped being like crazy party girl, and ultimately they get married. Some people like that decision. I think part of that decision had to do with the writers being of a certain age, because we do tend to put our own life into the comics. But it made the wheel a little bit more balanced. And then Flash had his own issues. All of a sudden we learned he wasn't really just a terrible guy, and he wasn't a horrible bully. He had suffered a lot of abuse when he grew up. He finally reaches an understanding with Peter, and they're a little bit better. So he can be more of a human being to him, and he's more of a friend. Harry gets crazier and nuttier as we go on. He becomes a Green Goblin on his side. So that's another terrible scenario. But so you can see now how we just start to use this as a tool, where we just start shifting people around, and it shakes things up when the world feels a little bit stale. And then the last edition we have for this is the Black Cat. After the wedding, and there was no more sort of sexual tension or love tension between, you know, Spidey and somebody, they introduced the Black Cat. And the Black Cat only loves Spider-Man. She doesn't even want to see what's under the mask. She's like super sexy. And even though Peter is married to a supermodel, he's torn between these two. So, you know, good on you, Peter, for not understanding true love. But that's what they did to mess with those, you know, with the wheel for a little bit of time there. So you can add characters, you can take characters away. I sort of rushed through the end of this, but I hope that you guys can see that this is a really useful tool if you combine it with theme and you make each of these characters serve a real purpose. So I'm going to turn that off now. So I think that hopefully that's useful to everybody. It's the sort of thing that does get you in the weeds a little bit. It's a little bit academic, but I think it's really useful because what we're doing, it is a craft, right? I mean, there are people who, you know, can just dive right in and they just want to sort of write their crazy chaotic stories, and that's fine. But I think that the structural stuff, the 3-act structure stuff is important. I think that knowing why you are building your cast is important, and putting the thought and the work into, do these characters reflect the theme that I'm trying to express overall in my story and embody in my main character. And the character wheel helps me for that. So hopefully that'll be a tool that's helpful for you guys as well. That is a lot of rambling out of me. I know that now we're at 5:15 your time. So if you want to do questions or something, I'm happy to do that. You all tell me, because if it's beer o'clock, as I was informed before, I don't want to keep anybody from the pub.
No, you can carry on. This is fantastic stuff. It's really, really useful as well, I think. I'm definitely going to be using it in my own life. So we have a question from Anne-Louise Stevens. Let me just see if I can find her in the participants list.
I think one just came up, yeah.
Anne, are you able to raise your hand on the sort of thing? Let me see.
I think I might have it if this is about, so I don't know, I can't see Anne, but she has a question here that she just put in the chat.
Yeah.
So if you use stories from your life, make them fictionalized, how do you avoid defamation, etc.? Which I love that that's a question. That's a little scary that you have to go after something like that. How unrecognizable does an episode character need to be? Can you use historical figures? So the second one's easier. Anybody who is in the public eye is fair game up to a certain point. It's sort of just this trade-off of once you're a known quantity, a celebrity, you're sort of free game for writers. But that there's a line that I couldn't exactly articulate. Like, so for example, if there was a minor celebrity that was in your sort of town, but they're not known on the world stage, I don't think they're fair game. But if you want, you know, if Boris is somebody you want to put in a comic, you can go after Boris. Like that's no hold barred. And I think it matters. It also depends on where you live. So you might have to check your sort of local laws for that sort of stuff. As far as characters that are based on real people, I would say this. If there is somebody that you are friendly with and you want to put them in, you could always ask and get their permission. There have been issues with that for people in the past. There's actually a complete moratorium on that at both Marvel and DC, because even when they got permission from people, if they didn't sign the right legal documents, there would be trouble. So if you want to use a type of person, I would say abstract them as far as you possibly can. And there's two reasons for that. One is the obvious, like legal ramifications, and you don't want to get called in for defamation or something like that. But it's also a little better for you, I think, as a writer, because when I would, my editor on Superman would occasionally call up and go, "So how are things going in the Kelly house?" And I'd say, "They're fine." Why? It's like, because Lois and Clark are fighting a lot this month. And I would literally take arguments that my wife and I had and put them in the book. She is stuck with me. So there was, she didn't really have a legal leg to stand on. But if that was a something that people knew about out in the world, and it was a friend or a colleague or something like that, then that might cause trouble. And the reason I would take the step back is because you can be a little more emotionally dispassionate and go, okay, what are the elements of this character or this situation that are compelling to me? Distill that down to its sort of prime DNA, and then reform it into something that is completely different. So if you're doing slice of life stuff, that becomes a little more challenging, and that may be a more direct answer to your question, and maybe not a good answer to your question. Things that happen to you that are autobiographical, generally, I think you're allowed to write about. It does come with risks. But if you can extrapolate and sort of move things along, but if you're like, I need to talk about this nasty boss I had, but I don't want people to know where the job was, and I don't want them to know their name or whatever, make a completely different job, or articulate that through a fantasy story where it's the head of the blacksmithing guild or whatever it's going to be. Try to figure out ways to extrapolate it. I think it'll also help. It'll help you intellectualize it a little bit better and not be so emotionally charged. So I hope that answers that question.
I think we have a question from Rob Price. I'm able to unmute him. So
okay.
Let's see.
Hi
Rob.
Evening. Thank you very much. It's been very informative, very enjoyable as well.
Right. Thank you.
Who would you recommend then to find out more about writing in 3 acts?
So there's so much. I forgot to find the art for you guys, but there's this thing called the Story Diamond, which I don't recommend. But if you look it up, it's more of a joke. And somebody put this out for real, and they took everybody's approach to storytelling. It's like the hero's journey and 3-act structure and Dan Harmon's story circle and all this stuff, and they put it in one giant diamond. And it's so many colors, like you could have a seizure looking at this thing. Like, it would drive you nuts. But I think ultimately their point was that storytelling is all kind of the same. It's we as human beings that currently exist in space-time in a linear fashion experience all stories, act 1, act 2, act 3. It's just how we learn that stuff. And we've been taught from childhood, once upon a time, and then this happened, the end, right? Like, it's just how stories go. So that's why I liked 3-act structure. And I just think it's the simplest and easiest way to understand it. So I would recommend, one of the ones that comes up a lot, though I don't personally, I haven't personally read it. Robert McKee's story comes up all the time. People really like that. It's generally for film. I really feel like I go back to the basics. I mean, it's sort of, Aristotle, not to sound like haughty or anything, but that was sort of, unity of place, unity of time. Like, these things are very, very old concepts, and they've worked. And I will say that 3-act structure specifically is a Western construct. We tell stories slightly different and culturally different than they do in the East. So, specifically in like manga and anime, they have different sort of touchstones for what makes a story. It was expressed well to me, like in a horror vernacular, where we tell stories about things falling apart in horror, and in Japan, they're actually about things coming back together, but the things coming back together in a nightmarish fashion, which I found pretty interesting. So there's a lot of, it's probably the easiest resource to find online in terms of, just 3-act structure. It's, I wish I had a sort of easier resource. It's kind of like, for me, it's sort of like, how would you, if you were learning carpentry, where's the best way to learn, how to do use a speed square or use a circular saw. Like, it's just such a basic tool that I have a tough time telling you where to go to look for that stuff. But it is pretty simple. And I think when you see any of these charts, it'll start to click pretty quickly. What I would ignore is people that, so this is why I don't like the Robert McKee stuff. The Robert McKee stuff is very clearly based on screenwriting. And it's like, okay, on page 12, this has to happen. And you find people that do that. By page X, you have to have the oh crap moment that does this. And on pages, I don't like that level of prescription. I don't know that that's valuable. But I think understanding that you have a status quo, the status quo is disrupted. The main character has to make a choice. Once they go off on their adventure, that's the end of Act 1. That's a point of no return.
I was going to go with the
Once you hit a point of no return, the story has to slowly escalate. It doesn't necessarily mean explosions and car chases, but the story gets more emotionally critical and the character is confronted with more obstacles as they go along towards a goal. That rising action is Act 2. And that's what essentially brings you up to the crisis. Like, this is an emotional crisis for the character, and it's going to be sort of the plot. This is sort of the do or die moment. In the most classic sense of Greek tragedy versus a comedy, if you're doing a comedy where people are going to live at the end, this is a dark moment. This looks like the hero is going to fail, or your protagonist is going to fail in whatever it is that they're going to do. If it's a tragedy, it looks like they're going to succeed. So Romeo and Juliet are totally like gonna get together. It's gonna work out. They're about to do it. And then because of they didn't have iPhones and clocks, they wind up drinking poison. It's terrible. So that's what makes that a tragedy, right? And then it descends. You get a different status quo at the end, which is not, it's sort of emotionally charged in a different way than the status quo in the beginning. And then sometimes there's a little denouement where you just are wrapping up some stuff. So that's the most basic overview. I think when you go into studying that stuff, you can get deep into the weeds 100% on how to break that stuff out. But those sweeping movements are basic 3-act structure. So I think almost anywhere that if you sort of look up online, a 3-act structure, as long as they're not getting too prescriptive about page count, I think you're going to be okay.
Okay, cool.
So I hope that helps. I'm sorry I don't have a better resource.
Kind of. I mean, I've only been writing my own stuff within the past couple of years, and I never really studied writing at all. And I've heard so much about the 3-act way of doing things, but I've never really looked into it. The way I've done it so far is just really through feeling that there should be some conflict and that should be overcome somehow. So, okay, then I'll do some more looking into the 3-act. Different ways of doing it in a 3-act structure. Yeah,
I think you just kind of hit the nail on the head. You have an instinctive way, like we have been told stories our entire lives, and it's really the same thing every single time. Not meaning that it's always the same story, but you get that sense. And when those moments don't happen, they actually feel dissatisfying, and you know it. You don't maybe always know why, but you know that there's something kind of off kilter about that story. Sometimes that's done to effect, and sometimes it's done unintentionally. One resource that did come to mind actually is Pixar put out a while ago their sort of story map, and that's really nice. It doesn't break it down necessarily into acts, but I think it's something along the lines of like, one day, and then there's a blank, and it's like, and then there's a blank, which caused a blank, and it sort of gives you the plot, the very simple plot thread to show status quo, rising action, crisis, resolution. So try that one. I think that's a pretty fun one, and it's a little more intuitive and a little less academic.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
So I think I'm afraid that's all the questions that we've got time for. But that has been truly enlightening. I think everyone has gotten something really good from that. So on behalf of LICAF, thank you all of you for coming to this free workshop. And thank you so much, Joe, for your time.
Oh, thank you, everybody. And yeah, I'm sorry I rambled too long.
No. It wasn't rambling. It was all very interesting. And if you have attended this workshop and you have found it useful, it would be amazing if you would head to our website and consider making a donation. You just need to click on the yellow heart in the top right-hand corner, and it will really help us next year maybe bring Joe Kelly to Kendall.
Yes, please just do it for me, just so I can come to Kendall. No, in all honesty, if it's something that you're capable of doing and you have the means, please help the folks out, because everybody works so hard every year to bring this festival together. But this year in particular, I know was really challenging. So yeah, and again, thank you all for coming. I hope it was informative, and I hope it was fun, and I hope to see you all in person someday. Thanks.
Thank you. Bye, everyone. Enjoy your evenings and enjoy your day, Joe.
Thank you very much. Take care, everybody.
Bye.